Hi, everyone. I'd like to give you all the big welcome, and I hope you've been enjoying the conference so far. My name is Jan, and I'm the founder of Phoebe, a data and design consultancy based in Myanmar and Singapore. I've worked with journalists and newsrooms in my home country, Myanmar, and in other countries in Southeast Asia for the past 5 years, helping them to do data journalism. I'll be sharing the lessons I've learned from my experience as a data viz practitioner working with journalists, especially in the Global South. Data journalism can seem ubiquitous these days. Every day, people are sharing the latest data-driven pieces with beautiful data viz from the world's top newsrooms like the New York Times, Washington Post, what have you. But if you look at the bigger picture of newsrooms all around the world, you'll find that actually data journalism is still practiced only by an elite few. Let's look at the data on this. The Sigma Data Journalism Awards, which is the most prestigious award for data journalism worldwide, received submissions from 267 different media organizations last year. But according to the World Association of News Publishers, there are more than 18,000 news organizations in the world today. So all the insightful data stories with beautiful visits that you're seeing on your Twitter feed, all of them come from a tiny fraction of newsrooms. We've all heard the story about how newspapers today are struggling to stay afloat. Their subscriptions and ad revenues are not what they used to be. Readers prefer scrolling through social media feeds over articles written by professional journalists and so on. In this climate, many newsrooms simply can't afford the investment in time and resources needed to start doing data journalism. That situation is even more challenging in the Global South, where newsrooms have even less resources and audiences might not be used to seeing data viz. That's where you come in. As a data visualization professional, there are ways that you can help. In many countries in the Global South, data journalism can be especially impactful because there are so many issues that haven't been covered from a data-driven point of view. Let me share an example from a project that my team and I worked on recently. Thailand and Laos are neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, and it's widely known that Thailand buys a lot of electricity from Laos, which mostly comes from hydropower dams. And these big dams also cause a lot of environmental problems all across the region. A typical news story about this issue usually just covers the latest development. As you can see on the story on the left, a new deal has been signed or another disaster struck because the dam had burst. Usually these stories don't shed light on the whole picture. My team and I worked with reporters from both Laos and Thailand to dig through the data, and we found that first of all, Thai electricity producers can't compete with the prices of cheap electricity from Laos. And what they do instead, as they try to transition away from fossil fuels, is that they've been investing heavily in building even more dams in Laos instead of investing in renewable energy in their own country, locking them into importing more electricity in the future. There are so many other examples like this of stories that are waiting to be told, and data visualization practitioners are in a really good position to help. I love this quote from Alberto Cairo, who is, of course, one of the most famous data viz practitioners today. He was on a podcast a few years ago talking about how journalism wasn't a profession, but more of a verb. He says, "You are a journalist if you have committed an act of journalism." And that quote really stuck with me. So 5 years ago, when I was learning data viz, I would write posts on my personal blog and dug into data sets about my country. For example, this one with the sunburst chart was about the government budget of Myanmar. The chief editor from a newsroom one day read my blog and contacted me to train the journalists in his newsroom on data journalism. And of course, I jumped at the chance because at that time, I was a big fan of data journalism, but I kept thinking, I'm just a data guy, I'm not a journalist. But looking back at Alberto's quote, I had been committing acts of journalism. The story on the right is what came out of my first collaboration with a newsroom. It's about how doctors and nurses in Myanmar are having to leave the field because it doesn't pay well, leading to a huge shortage of medical workers all across the country. Since then, I've been doing freelancing work and working more on data journalism. And eventually I moved from just being a freelancer to building a team that does the same kind of work. My experiences so far have taught me a lot about the challenges newsrooms face when trying to do data journalism. I'll break the challenges down into 4 different aspects. One, working with journalists, and then working with editors and decision makers in the newsrooms, and then with data and funders. For the last two, I'll talk about the specific challenges faced in the Global South. First, here's what usually comes up when you're working with a journalist who hasn't done data journalism before. There are, of course, the requirements for data literacy, learning how to use tools such as for scraping, analysis, viz, and so on. But I find that the most important hurdle for them is that it's an entirely new way of thinking for them. Journalists are used to interviewing subject matter experts and putting together a story from what their human sources say. They're not used to analyzing their own data and drawing their own conclusions. Their instinct is to call someone up who knows more about the subject than they do, which is a good instinct, but they also have to learn to balance it with doing their own analysis when starting to do data journalism. They're also very used to the quick turnaround times in newsrooms. Unless you're working with an investigative journalist, they won't have the luxury of spending weeks or months on a story. There's been so many times when a journalist that I'm collaborating with would be pulled away to cover some other breaking news. One thing that journalists are really good at is identifying newsworthy stories that readers will be interested in. I definitely recommend following their guidance on this. It's totally okay to throw out data sets that you find interesting or cool ideas for visits that you have if they don't add to the main points of the story that you want to get across. You'll be working mostly with reporters who are the ones writing the stories, but don't ignore the relationships with their editors, who are definitely one of your most important allies. Over the past 5 years in my interactions with editors and decision makers in newsrooms in Southeast Asia, their opinion about data journalism has shifted from, oh, this is too ambitious, there's no way we can do this, to in recent years it's become more of, we want more engagement from our readers and maybe shiny data viz could be the solution, ? So newsrooms all over the world, but especially in the Global South, are under-resourced, but they are also pressured to do innovative new things at the same time. So there's a tendency to have shiny object syndrome, in air quotes, where they are always looking for a new trend that can be a shortcut to bringing in new readers. But you have to break it to them that there are no shortcuts to developing data journalism in their newsrooms. Despite the challenges, if you want to help a newsroom develop data journalism capacity, getting buy-in from editors is crucial. If the editors don't feel like data journalism is a long-term strategic priority for the newsroom, you won't be able to help them sustainably continue making data stories. The next two challenges specifically relate to working in the Global South. In these countries, there is a common complaint that there is just not enough data available to do data journalism. In my experience, that is not true. There's always data available. The difference is that the data is just not one simple Google search away. You have to be especially familiar with the institutions that publish the data. There are so many people in government and nonprofit organizations that want the public to use their data, but they don't have a lot of capacity to publish it in digitized machine-readable formats. So get to know these people in person, and they will be able to share you something like a specific link to a report that's buried deep inside a government website. Or, I've had a lot of instances where they will say, yes, the data is publicly available. We just haven't gotten around to uploading it on our website. Often you will find that there are data quality issues, but if you don't look at the data in the first place with the intention of writing a story about it, no one would have noticed the data quality issues. Data quality improves iteratively when people use it regularly and start pointing out the shortcomings. If nobody uses the data, nobody will know that there is flaws in the data to begin with. So if you, as a data person, don't know where to start in getting in touch with these people who have the data, don't worry. Everywhere in the world, there are geeks who have been doing that work over the past 10 years. The open data and civic tech movements have done a lot to make sure data is publicly available. You don't have to be the one scraping all the tables from a 300-page PDF file. The open data community specializes in doing that. If you do end up scraping, digitizing, or cleaning a bunch of data, you can also share it with the community. That is not just a great way to give back to the community, but this kind of transparency also protects you and your collaborators from potential lawsuits. To do this work sustainably, you will need to find ways to get paid. Unfortunately, that is not as straightforward as getting a job in a newsroom or getting hired on a freelance basis. Especially in the Global South, newsrooms won't have a lot of resources to devote to data journalism, which means they won't have the money often to hire you directly. So you will have to get hired indirectly instead. These days, there are a lot of organizations that fund data journalism. For example, the Google News Initiative and the Meta Journalism Project. There are also organizations that specialize in funding media development, like Internews. Sometimes, some organizations will have a particular data set that they want journalists to write stories about, and they will get the help of a data visualization person to work together with a newsroom to write a story. What I found is that having your own portfolio of data stories is important to get your foot in the door, but you don't need that many pieces in your portfolio. Even having 1 or 2 good pieces is enough, and after that, you can focus on networking. A lot of people who will be potentially funding you are not browsing the web looking for portfolios. You have to try to reach them. And usually getting in touch with one person who is already well connected with both the data practitioners and the funding organizations is all you need to get started. So in this next segment, I'll outline 4 different ways that you can collaborate with journalists and newsrooms. There are 3 things that have to come together for any data journalism story: the writing of the text, the data wrangling and analysis, and the information design and data viz. Each of the ways of collaborating that I'm going to share here focuses on one of these parts. And the 4th way is to collaborate by training the journalists so that they can do these things on their own. All the approaches I outline here are from the perspective of someone who is not a full-time staff member of a newsroom, but for freelancers, consultants, trainers, and contributors. If you get a chance to join a newsroom as a full-time data journalist, that's a great opportunity and probably the best way to jump right into data journalism. But in my experience, especially for newsrooms in the Global South, it's very rare for a newsroom to have enough resources to hire full-time data journalists. But if you're living in a country where newsrooms do hire and have internships for data journalists, and you're really excited about working with a particular newsroom, I definitely recommend that option. You'll learn a lot of things really fast and have a lot of impact. Okay, so approach 1. This first approach is the easiest. You take the role of a data visualization designer and you just create the viz that goes along with the story. This is an ideal option for a freelance gig as a data viz person working in a newsroom for the first time. In this approach, you'll be creating the vizes in parallel with the journalist who is doing the writing. And the story and the vizes are not so tightly intertwined, so you don't have to do a lot of back and forth with the journalist. This kind of approach works when the journalist already knows what they want to show with the data, and the data is from a well-known source that doesn't require lots of deep contextual knowledge to get your head around. For example, elections data, like this interactive map on the left, which is a story about Myanmar's 2020 elections. Another situation is where you can add a lot of value is just doing the viz with a journalist who's writing a story, and the journalist is already really good at analyzing data. They just don't know how to show that data in a visually appealing way. And when we say a journalist who is really good at analyzing the data, we're not talking about super advanced data skills yet. If the journalist is comfortable enough to use pivot tables properly, you're already in good shape. The example below is from a story I worked with from the Philippines, where it's about how the largest banks in the Philippines have a lot of investments in coal companies despite claims that they're divesting from fossil fuels. The journalist who worked on this story already had done the data analysis. She's figured out the flow of the story. And the only thing I helped her with was figuring out the viz ideas and checking the data. The next approach is harder. Here, you and the journalist are working closely together, and you have a general topic in mind, and you have some data sources that you've looked into, but the story is still taking shape. You might get into this kind of arrangement when you team up with a journalist to pitch a story together to an editor, or you're playing the role of a data mentor to a journalist who is working through their first couple of data stories. You'll have to go through more than a few data sources before you get something that is interesting and newsworthy enough. So there'll be a lot of back and forth iterating through ideas for the flow of the story, the insights from the data, and the ideas for how to present the data bits. Here's where you shouldn't be too tied to particular viz ideas if they don't add to the story. The story on the left is one where I worked with a business journalist from Singapore, and we dug into data on hundreds and thousands of real estate transactions. And in the end, instead of the initial ideas we had for complicated interactive maps and charts, we decided that the most interesting story was one that was focused on just one particular neighborhood where a lot of real estate speculation had occurred. In this approach, you'll need to do a lot of context switching between data analysis, brainstorming story ideas, and visual design of the business. It's a good idea to partner up with another data person who has a slightly different specialization. In the example on the right about Chinese economic involvements in Myanmar, I worked together with another data person and 2 other journalists. I focused only on the data scraping and creating the visualizations, while my partner did a lot of the work on doing the data analysis and finding the story in the data. You don't have to be a unicorn who knows every single data skill out there to be able to do data journalism. The next approach is to become a full-fledged data journalist and work on both the data and the writing yourself. Logistically, this is simpler than the previous approach because you don't have to sync up with a collaborating journalist. But of course, there's a lot more work. Also, given the variety of skills involved, it's very difficult to pull off on your own. From my experience, this kind of approach can be for passion projects in more niche areas where you aren't under tremendous time pressure to publish, and you can try out more experimental data visualizations and add a bit of flair. Picking an evergreen topic also helps you escape the time pressure of the news cycle. The example I show here is one where I looked into a very niche topic of estimating the value of the jade industry in Myanmar, which is one of the country's largest exports, but it's also an industry that is riddled with corruption and smuggling, hence the difficulty in estimating the value. It gave me a chance to try out more non-conventional data viz ideas and experiment with creating custom interactive viz. Sometimes taking the time to do more experimental storytelling on niche stories can be a great way to bring attention to the topic that might otherwise seem too wonky or technical. And it's also a great way to highlight the newsroom that publishes it. Finally, another very common type of approach, and one that's commonly funded by media development organizations like Google News Initiative, and that is training. Here, you can have something that ranges from a short workshop that is just a few sessions to engagements that last many months and really get in depth and give the journalists that you're training a lot of room to practice the skills by working on their own projects. While preparing for this talk, I had chats with a few different data journalism trainers who work in the region. And one thing that we all agreed on is that if you want the journalists to be able to confidently create their own data journalism stories after the training ends, you really need the longer term multi-month trainings. On top of that, you will need to follow up the training with some sort of mentoring program so that if the journalist has questions or gets stuck, you can be around to help them. Right now, my team and I are wrapping up one of these long trainings. We trained 2 cohorts of Southeast Asian environmental journalists on all the basics of data journalism and collaborated with them to produce stories ranging from the decline of fisheries in Cambodia to the destruction of mangroves in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam to the hydropower relations between Laos and Thailand that I was talking about earlier. Now, what are the things that you really should try to avoid? I wanted to point out 2 things in particular, especially if you're working in the Global South. First, that this unfortunately a long history of parachute journalism. This is where a journalist comes to a place that they don't have a lot of contextual knowledge for, stays for a few days, and write a story about the place that is shallow or exoticizes the place, and generally reiterates all the stereotypes. I really hope people will do less of this because it doesn't help anyone. It can be worse if you're doing data journalism about a place that you don't know the context of, because a lot of data sets really require you to know the context around it in order to understand the data properly, but also be aware of the flaws in the data. And that's not all. You can actively endanger your collaborators if you're not aware of the political sensitivities of that place. You as a foreigner won't be harmed, but your local collaborators might face serious consequences like lawsuits or even prison. When you write a story about a place that you do have a contextual knowledge of, you dig beyond the cliches, you know where to get the data sets that do not come up on the Google searches, and most importantly, you care about the place and want a sustained relationship with it. The second thing is the expectation that the only way to be successful in data journalism is to be a unicorn who does it all. From data scraping to analysis to writing stories to designing and coding up beautiful interactive business. This perception really makes data journalism seem like a field that has very high barriers to entry. And as someone who wants more newsrooms to pick up data journalism, we really have to dismantle this notion. These days, with all the tools, the learning materials, the professional communities out there like the Data Viz Society, data journalism is now more accessible than it has ever been. And the more we foster a culture of collaboration that is beginner-friendly, the more we can help newsrooms all over the world develop their data journalism capacity. This is easier said than done, of course, because especially when working with a newsroom where you are the only data person that they know, everyone will come to you for all sorts of data-related problems. And you will find yourself saying, well, I guess I could try to learn how to do it and give it a shot. But trust me, this road will most likely lead to burnout. And by stretching yourself too thin, you won't have the time to sharpen the skills that you're really passionate about. So how can you get started? As Alberto Cairo recommends, you can commit X to journalism. This means having a portfolio of your own data stories. And here, the thing to remember is that quality trumps quality. Quality trumps quantity. One or two good stories are better than lots of mediocre ones. If you can partner up with an organization that is already doing data journalism training, you can work with them as a trainer or a visualization designer or a mentor, and that lets you get in touch with journalists and get a feel for their work. If you come across an opportunity to embed yourself in a newsroom through an internship, a fellowship, that's a really excellent opportunity to really get the guts of the newsroom. Finally, there are lots of organizations and communities that are adjacent to data journalism, such as open data, civic tech, and of course, data viz communities. And you can often find data-curious journalists hanging out in these spaces. In our region, in Southeast Asia, we have organizations such as Dataful in Bangladesh, my company BB in Myanmar, PunchUp in Thailand, Open Development Cambodia, Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, DataN in Malaysia, Continentalist in Singapore, the Indonesian Data Journalism Network, and there's also a network of media startups called Splice Media. And for international organizations, there are communities like Hex Hikers, Journal Coders, and School of Data that do this kind of work globally. And there are specific organizations like Data for Change and DataKind that specialize in partnering data professionals with civil society. A big thank you to all of you at Outlier Conference for the opportunity. You can say hi to me or email me at the handles and addresses below. And I would like to especially thank my mentors, Mick and Bella from Continentalist, and Kang, Eva, Lisa for bouncing ideas with me for this talk, and to my buddies at the Google Films for video editing. I'll be sharing my slides, of course, and I've included links to articles that discuss more about the topics that I've covered, and links to all the articles and organizations that I mentioned.